Okay, we are live. You can start.
Good afternoon, everybody. Very happy to see you here in our webinar this afternoon. I'm greeting you from Lisbon in Portugal. Special day here because it's a day of the revolution with a lot of marches around the city. And of course, that revolution in '74 has a lot to do with what we discussed today, European integrations, elections, and democracy. I welcome you on behalf of the SEEEDS program, which you see in my background. SEEEDS stands for Supporting Engagement in European Elections and Democratic Societies. It's an EU-funded project. The European Parliament elections are in 1 year, and we hope with these events to lay the seeds of public interest and the seeds for triggering more debates on those elections. From a standpoint of public interest, I think it's not yet very high on anybody's agenda. It's still a year off. From a technical standpoint, of course, 1 year is very little. If you think of reforming election laws, I think there are some proposals in the European Parliament. Time is running out. If you also think of political platforms of parties, this is a moment where they start firming them up and having their debates to decide what those elections will be about for them. How should we think about these elections? In 2024, of course, we have an obviously interesting situation since the last European Parliament elections with COVID first and then the Russian war against Ukraine, which has both put the EU quite into the spotlight. I remember very vividly in 2019, we were very afraid that there could be a wave of extremist parties entering the European Parliament and having a very dominant position there. There was a lot of mobilization around that idea and quite successful. Turnout was higher than in previous elections. And the extremist wave basically didn't happen. So there was a lot of relief. I think the situation may not be totally different. I'm a little bit skeptical, though, to always portray every EP election as a big moment of crisis and danger, because it fuels a bit this idea that the EU is something fragile that could be swept away if there are the wrong election results. And I think talking this way about the EU makes it appear weak and maybe be perceived as weaker than it is, and that's not really helpful. I think the EU is long established. We see its importance in so many crises these days, and we shouldn't just see everything as a crisis event. I would say, like any election, it's a great opportunity for democratic renewal, and we should look forward to those elections. Of course, there are concerns, and we had a poll among you about what you see as the main concerns, and we will discuss them. I would just add one specific one, because for many years I've been very involved in election observation. And we have one member state where the official election observers of the OSCE have concluded twice that elections do not conform to democratic standards. I'm talking about Hungary. And it is a question for me how you deal with a member state that holds such elections and sends people to Brussels to make decisions for all of us. Are we just shrugging shoulders and accepting that, or is there something that we can do about that? So this is one more element I would like to add as a possible point for discussion. I welcome you all on behalf of the 4 organizers of this event, which is the European Partnership for Democracy, a network of 19 European democracy organizations, of which my organization is also a part, Democracy Reporting International. We deal a lot with rule of law across the EU, with digital democracy, and generally with elections. So we are very happy to be part of this group working on this. We have Election Watch, which has done quite a pioneer activity in 2019, assessing the European Parliament elections then. And we have the European Partnership for Democratic Elections, which brings together a lot of election observation groups, in particular from Central and Eastern Europe. So we are a really good group, I think, to look at the subject. And I welcome you on behalf of all 4 of them. And with this, I hand over the floor to our moderator. We are very happy to have with us here Amanda Coakley, and she will introduce the participants here. And Amanda is an award-winning journalist. She's a senior reporter for Coda Story. Amanda, you'll tell us a little bit more about that, I think. And before, she has been a freelance journalist for Politico, published in BBC and Deutsche Welle and many other publications that I think play quite a big role in shaping European debates. So that's very fitting. And I saw that you were also involved with the Pakistan election in 2018. That made me happy because DRI has been working in Pakistan for many years and many years on elections. And so welcome, everybody. I wish us a fruitful debate, and I hand the floor to you, Amanda. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that kind invitation, and welcome everybody to this webinar. This is webinar 4, and it is, as you know, risks and opportunities in the European elections. So yes, my name is Amanda Coakley. I am a senior staff correspondent at Coda Story. I cover Eastern Europe and Central Europe, and Coda Story is a US-based nonprofit newsroom, and all of the stories that we produce have to hit on one of our 4 key topics, and they are disinformation, authoritarian technology, the war on science, and rewriting history. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here. First of all, a little bit of housekeeping, if you don't mind. We will have an interactive Miro board, which will accompany this panel debate, and we encourage you to be as interactive as you can. As you hear from our speakers, engagement in the European elections will be key, so we hope that you will engage with this panel so we can all get the most out of it. Comments are welcome, questions are welcome, so please, we want to hear from you. As well, I just want to reiterate that this entire webinar is being streamed live on YouTube. So if you don't want your comment or question to be read out live on YouTube, don't say you weren't warned. And I will try to get as many comments and questions to our speakers as possible. So therefore, I would like to introduce our speakers. We have a great lineup. First of all, we have Ms. Camila Mortera Martinez. She is joining us. We have Ms. Sabrina Spileder and Ms. Ingeborg Solrun Glislo-Dieter. And we hope to be joined very shortly by Professor Alberto Alemano. Thank you all very much for being here with us. So as we know, there was a survey gone out over the past week to a very wide network, and the people in the survey were asked about risks and opportunities for the European elections. And very quickly, I just want to highlight the key findings. So the risks. The key risk that the survey identified was disinformation campaigns by external actors. And following on from this, the other risks that were identified were low voter participation, biased media reporting, political parties and politicians undermining trust in the integrity of the European elections. And the other risk that came up was shrinking civic space, impacting political mobilization in some member states. And then when it comes to opportunities, the opportunities identified by the survey was more European representation through possible transnational voting lists, and we'll be touching on that as well in the forthcoming conversation. And the following ones were opportunity to debate European topics like climate change or deepening the EU before enlargement, to create broader European debate and campaign on key topics beyond national interests. I think that links very much as well to the earlier one on climate change. And then some people said no opportunities will emerge. So glass half full there from our participants in the survey. But someone who has a very different take is Ms. Mortera Martinez. We're now going to give some opening remarks between 5 and 7 minutes long, and then we will ask questions and then open to the floor. But Ms. Mortera Martinez, can you please tell us why you have an optimistic argument about the European elections next year?
Thank you, Amanda. I think I'm here to disagree with everybody. So with the 11% of people that think there are no opportunities in this election, and also with Michael, who says that politically it's still too early to be thinking about the European elections. I'm talking to you literally from the Schuman roundabouts, and I can assure you that the chat has already started. And I absolutely love these 18 months of the year where we can basically talk about a European demo, Spitzenkandidaten, and people actually understand what you're talking about. Of course, in order to get people even more interested, you have to offer them some political gossip on the side, which unfortunately I will not have the time to do today. But yes, I'm just here indeed to disagree with all those people who think that there are no opportunities in this election. So I'm here to make the optimistic case for the next European Parliament elections. I actually think that these are going to be a very different set of elections next year, not because of any of the sort of technical reasons that you might be thinking of, like transnational lists, which is one thing that is very important, and we should talk about it later, or even Spitzenkandidaten, or you name it. I think these elections are going to be different because they are going to be the first elections we have after a pandemic and a war. I do think, and maybe I'm wrong, there are some people who disagree with me in this town, but I do think that both the pandemic and the war have changed the European Union forever. I don't think there is any way to go back to the status quo ex ante. As you know, following Putin's attack in Ukraine, unity was the European Union's biggest challenge, but also its biggest success. So we agreed on several rounds of sanctions and at unprecedented speed, trigger a previously unused law to grant millions of Ukrainian refugees instant access to the European Union and its labor markets, and gave Ukraine candidate status less than 6 months after the conflict began. This is not to talk about weapons deliveries for an organization that began, as Boris Johnson would have you thinking, regulating the bending of bananas, and the union's, in my view, impressive energy turnaround. There are no winners in this war so far. We hope that Ukraine will be the winner, but it is very, very true that the European Commission has managed to be much more strong than it was by acting decisively and taking public positions, for example, on refugees and on enlargement that member states sometimes find politically difficult. To me, this presents an incredible opportunity for the next elections, because not only do we have new European public goods emerging, so we have health with the pandemic, but we had with the war energy and defense, but also an increasing public space, or if you want it, a demos, where these are being discussed. So I was previously very skeptic about the Spitzenkandidaten process. I thought this was not necessarily a very good idea. It was not an idea that would actually fix anything when it comes to European democratic participation. And now I'm sort of revising this view. So I'm going to tell you first why I was sort of skeptic about it, and then I'm going to tell you why I'm no longer a skeptic and why I think it might actually be even a good idea. So the first reason why I thought that the Spitzenkandidaten process, as you know, is the lead candidate process, so the one where the candidate with most votes in the European elections gets to be president of the European Commission, and a process that only worked once with Jean-Claude Juncker in 2014. And by the way, it is not legally enshrined in the treaties, so it's not something that the institutions are obliged to do. But I was telling you about the first reason why I thought that the Spitzenkandidaten process was not necessarily a good idea. So the first one was because I hate this idea that democratic input in the European Union comes only from the European Parliament elections. I am one that used to believe that democratic input in the European Union came mostly from elected governments that act through the Council of Ministers and in the European Council, and that the European Parliament still has some deficiencies when it comes to the way elections are held. We know that, once again, transnational lists are not a thing, and they, you know, that's a problem to sort of create a European sphere for the elections. But mostly, and that is my main problem with these elections, mostly national parties make them all about national issues. So that's why I think the European elections are still sort of a second order national elections, and they are not as democratic as they should be. So the second reason why I thought the Spitzenkandidaten process was a bad idea, it's because politicizing the European Commission did not seem to me at the time a good idea. And the main reason why is because the guardian of the treaty cannot and should not be political. But that was then. Everything with the war, with the pandemic, has now changed. So both the pandemic and the war and everything that came with them, lockdowns, death, restrictions, supply chain problems, refugees, weapons deliveries, nuclear threats, rising cost of living, you name it, have had such an impact on people's day-to-day lives that I think whatever layer of government is responsible for them is necessarily going to become highly politicized too. So take the example of the pandemic. Health competences were decentralized until they weren't. Examples include not only the common procurement of vaccines, but also the European COVID passports and, crucially, the recovery funds. In the war, most of Europe's response has happened at European Union level. So now the two problems me and many people had with the Spitzenkandidaten process have suddenly changed, because EU leaders must take positions on things that European Union citizens not only understand, but also care about. Are you willing to support Ukraine, whatever it takes? Should the recovery fund be made permanent? Do you think the European Union should purchase critical material like vaccines, but also gas and protective equipment together? Lines of political contestation are actually emerging between political candidates. And I'm just going to take you through a fictional face-off between, say, Ursula von der Leyen and Sarah Marin. Both, so one from the EPP, the other one from the S&D, are staunchly pro-Ukraine, but the former is fiscally proliferates, where the latter is frugal. Von der Leyen seems to support a more strategic autonomous Europe, while Marin wants a better relationship with the with the US. Unlike previous elections, there is a potential for having candidates that are not only relatively known across the European Union, but that hold visible positions on a number of what can be called traditional national matters. So the second problem with the Spitzenkandidaten process, the idea that you should not politicize the European Commission, has all but disappeared again because of the pandemic, but mostly because of the war. There is no way the next European Commission does not become even more political than the one we have now. So this leads me to my concluding point. Sorry, I'm at a place full of people, so I'm a bit distracted today, which is that these elections, for the first time, have the potential to actually change things in a very visible and very short-term way for European citizens. And I think we should harness, we in Brussels and those of us, writing and thinking about the European Union, we should harness that potential for to sort of bring people together. And I'm just saying that Amanda has told me that I have 1 minute left, so I'm just going to leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much for your remarks. And I just want to let everyone know that unfortunately Camino has to leave us early, so we won't have a chance for a Q&A with her, but I want to thank you very much for that. And I think one thing that I've really taken away from what you said is about how national parties make these elections sometimes about national issues, and I'm definitely want to touch on that later on, so thank you very much. I'd like to go now to Ms. Gisela-Dotter. Would you like to give us your opening remarks, initial thoughts on these findings? Thank you.
Sorry, I lost you. But I think I'm in again. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. I wish I could be as optimistic as the previous speaker about the upcoming elections, and I'm not. But it's okay, because I'm going to talk about the main challenges or threats, so not the opportunities. Of course, there are opportunities in all elections. There's the question of how the main players make use of these opportunities or enhance the opportunities that could be there. But I think the EU is going to face a lot of challenges with these upcoming elections, and I will just focus on a few of them. I'm coming from a country that is a non-EU member state. I also worked quite a lot for an organization that has done election observation in different member states of the EU, but not the EU as such, only once in 2009. But after that, it hasn't done election observation in the EU, and I think actually it could be a good idea to do that. I know it's complicated, but since we can't do election observation in the US for the elections to the Senate and to the in general elections in the US, one should be able to do it in the EU as such. Just an idea that I'm floating here. But what I see as the main challenges or threats, it's one of the things that was also mentioned in the survey that you've just published, is the low voter turnout. I think it's one of the biggest challenges of any elections to get people to actually go out and vote. And like in the survey, around 22% of the respondents saw it as a threat or a risk. I think since the first direct elections in 1979 in the EU, the voter turnout has been declining, with the exception actually of the elections in 2019. And the question remains whether whether will be further decline, or if the 2019 election was a new trend, so we could possibly see a higher turnout in these elections than before. But I think the challenge of low voter turnout is something that is especially true for countries where citizens may feel disconnected from the EU, or may not see the relevance of the EU elections for their daily life. We see that we have higher turnout in countries that are what we can call old democracies, smaller countries that are old democracies, but we see a lower turnout in some of these new democracies, like we saw it in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Slovenia, which quite a low turnout in last elections. And I think this is one of the issues, but this is very much connected to another issue that is a challenge, which is a lack of trust in politicians. Voters think that the candidates are just looking for a well-paid and convenient job, and they do not have integrity nor a genuine interest in making the EU work better for the general public. And of course, you know, scandals such as the Qatargate is not helpful in this connection, and could kind of further enhance this idea about those who are running for the parliament, that they are doing it for their own sake, to get a well-paid job. And maybe also, which is an idea on many voters, a job in between other jobs. They're waiting, some people that are waiting for something better, they run for the EU parliament. But there are, of course, a lot of parties and peoples that are campaigning on anti-EU platforms. We have seen it in recent years that populist movements have gained momentum in many EU countries, and this trend could continue into the upcoming EU elections. And the success of the populist parties could undermine the legitimacy of the EU as an institution. Of course, the reason why these parties have been gaining ground have been contentious issues like immigration, which was not mentioned as a risk in this survey, which is interesting, but maybe it's just continuous risk, accepted as a continuous risk, the immigration issue. But it could come up in the upcoming elections with the ongoing refugee crisis. There are many voters that may be concerned about the impact of immigration on their economies and societies, which would then again influence the voter behavior. And they might feel that the EU has not been able to deal with these issues in a proper manner. Also, the war in Ukraine and related to that, the increased cost of living with higher inflation, which is a consequence of the war, might have an impact and increase the support of the populist movements. Although the EU has been, in many ways doing a good job when it comes to the war in Ukraine and has been standing better together, then nonetheless people might start feeling that the consequences of the war, that they are paying the price for the war with increased cost of living, and that might reflect on the EU as well. And then, Brexit fallout could also play a role there. These are the first elections since Brexit, and it remains to be seen how this will impact the elections. It could further rise the anti-EU sentiments, but it could also mobilize those who are for the EU and see the EU as a bulwark towards these groups that are gained ground in the Brexit. I think I found it interesting how many of those who answered the survey mentioned disinformation from external actors as a main threat. I think that's quite new, and it's interesting that people are so concerned about the foreign interference. Maybe that is also related to the war in Ukraine, that they are afraid that the Russians will carry out and try to have an impact on the leadership of the European Union and might carry out disinformation campaigns. Of course, many countries and the EU has taken steps to combat these kind of threats, but it remains to be seen how effective these measures would be in the upcoming elections. Cybersecurity is a critical issue in ensuring that the elections are free and fair. And so it's very important that the EU is taking measures to ensure that they would not be affecting the elections. Then there's the media landscape. There is a captured media landscape in some EU countries, and that can pose a significant challenge for campaigning in the EU member states. And candidates may struggle to get their message out to the public. They might have limited opportunities for debate in these countries where there is a captured media landscape. I think, most likely candidates and political parties will try to find alternative ways, they usually do, to reach voters and build support, such as through social media and grassroots organizing. I think, like I said, there are a lot of threats and challenges. The question is always, how do those who are running for the elections, candidates and parties, how do they react to these challenges? How do they counteract these challenges? And although we have seen in recent years backsliding in democratic values, it's also possible that people feel this backsliding as an existential threat to the EU and all the values that the EU stands for. And when you are faced with existential threats, it often kind of mobilizes people to take actions. And that could also happen, that people would really be mobilized to take action against all these threats that are are existential threats for the EU and its values. I think I'll just stop there.
Thank you so much. And I think the points that you raise about low voter turnout and the trust in politicians and how at times people can see the European elections as something very far away and something that doesn't kind of directly impact their lives, or as you say, politicians looking for an easy ride or an easy job, or to kind of stay in the political arena, but while waiting for a bigger job at home. And I'd love to come back to you about those topics later on. But now I'd like to go to Sabrina Spieleder, and you're going to talk to us actually about disinformation, one of your key topics, and maybe how that is entering into the public conversation for these elections. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Thank you for the invitation. Indeed, I indicated that I would be talking about risks today, the risk of foreign disinformation. And now the previous speaker already mentioned the survey results, that this was the one of the prime concerns that the participants of the survey had. Now, there's different interpretations of this. Is it new? Are they more concerned than they were last time? Because I already worked during the 2019 elections on the topic in a different capacity. There was already a lot of attention on the topic of foreign disinformation in 2019, a lot of research coming out. So it was on the radar, at least of the expert community. So why is this? I choose, based on no facts whatsoever, the following explanation. Awareness of this threat is much bigger. People know that there are foreign actors out there who intentionally, strategically, and in a coordinated manner try to undermine democratic processes and institutions in the European Union and globally, for that matter. So I choose to believe that over the past years and years that the European Union, at the level of the EU institutions, but also at the level of the EU member states and at the level of civil society, this being one of the prime examples, have worked on this, that this actually helped to raise awareness of this type of activity. I think when we look at that, especially in the context of elections, though, we need to be careful to not use the label of disinformation for just anything that we see. We've seen how that has happened with fake news a couple of years earlier, that it used to be applied to a very specific situation, but then it was just weaponized against freedom of expression, against the media. And I think also, we as EU institutions, for us in the External Action Service, but also as an expert community, we need to be very precise what we're looking at, because of course it's an election. It's a very polarized environment that we're operating in. Factual information needs to be provided, but it's an election. People want to present themselves in the best way, of course. Also, there's a lot of misinformation around elections, how the EU elections work. So I think, like, genuinely, just not a proper understanding of the processes of how, unfortunately, how the complexity of the EU works. So I think we need to be very careful not to label everything foreign, especially foreign disinformation. So we need to have proper research into this. Again, I said I talk about the risks, but the opportunities just keep coming. You know, the positive things that we have as a community grown over the last couple of years. Unfortunately, and when I talk about communities, the EU institutions, the member states, civil society organizations, independent media, also the private sector, international partners, we've grown in our understanding of how this works. We've gotten better at exposing this, at raising awareness. But actually, so we need to, as a community, just communicate about this better, and also, portray, foster this understanding that, for example, Russia over the last couple of years has been engaged in this. It's not just during the election time. I think, we can never start too early, because this kind of undermining of democratic processes and institutions, we've seen it during COVID, where we didn't have, like, next year European elections. It was undermining of our response. It was discrediting our collaboration in this area, the measures that were taken to basically say we're imposing, draconian measures, and this is undemocratic, and, people are forced back. I heard in Germany, this is basically back in the GDR, which are analogies that are nowhere near reality. But these seeds have been seeded back then already. During the war now, Russia is immensely involved in information manipulation and interference right now in the preparation and execution of the war. We have in our public-facing website, EU versus Disinfo, if you want to take a look, a couple of cases where it says, there is no democracy in Germany. There's no elections, not even a constitution. Lithuania is a dying democracy. Democracy always leads to terror. So you have those direct attacks on democracy, but it's more this daily, constant attacking of democratic or universal values of politicians, of the institutions, of the international rules-based order. All of these things happen on a daily basis, and I think that's the main thing that I want to convey today. This is a daily fight that we are fighting, unfortunately, and not just from Russia, also other actors. So we need to have an eye on this every day, not just in the run-up to elections, to be effective in tackling it. And then, I mean, the previous speakers, all of what you said, I could make a lovely disinformation campaign out of this, because indeed, this information manipulation attaches itself to topics that are already connected to a lot of passionate debates, but also to issues that are dividing already. So this would be lovely. But just to make that point, that also suppression is part of this information manipulation. Critical voices you don't like, independent voices that criticize a certain kind of policy. We've seen that being done by foreign actors who target women, for example, through gender disinformation, LGBTIQ persons, specifically to flush them out of the public debate. And if you're talking about a democracy and about elections, you really want a representation of society. So I would say, you know, there is a lot of risks, but I would also say that we as a community have gone quite a long way since the last elections, and I hope that this will manifest next year as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And as someone that also works in the disinformation space, I can totally resonate with your point on that daily chipping away. It's not just one big story that gets put into the European information space. It's a slow and steady, consistent process that happens day in, day out, so that people after a while don't even realize that they're reading something that might be very far away from the truth. But Ms. Giesler, I wanted to come back to you on voter turnout, and I guess I'm going to ask you both one question, and then we'll take audience questions. I can see your questions coming in on the Miro board. Thank you all very much for participating so far. But I wanted to ask you on low voter turnout, and you talked about engagement. What are realistic things that can be done from your perspective to really kind of boost people's awareness, A, of the European elections, and then B, what should we be kind of working on to make sure that they actually cast their vote? What do you think are the most important drivers?
Oh, that's a big question, because this is something that you're struggling with in not only the EU elections, but also at national level. And there's a trend, you see it in many countries, that there's the lower turnout in elections. That's a trend in declining participation in elections. So that is worrisome. And, even, more difficult to kind of engage people when it comes to EU elections than elections at national level, because this is something that is not as close to people as local governments or national governments. But what I think is important, it is, that the people kind of understand, and that's, of course, the politicians have to take the lead in that how important it is to show that the EU is an important player, and it's that the EU political leadership has a very important role to play nowadays in all these issues that we are dealing with, be it climate change, be it the war in Ukraine, be it immigration, be it, disinformation, whatever it is, that the EU is a very important player there. And it's kind of all these people that really believe in the importance of the EU as an institution and as an idea, that they have to come out and mobilize people. Because those who are against the EU, those who are, part of the populist movement, they sometimes, it's easier for them to mobilize people because they do it, not on a rational level, but more on a, the feelings, using the feelings that are kind of the people's feelings against the EU as an institution. So this is, I think, one of the most important things, that all those who really believe in the importance of the EU, they come out, they mobilize people, and they convey the feeling that this is a kind of what should we say, existential threat we could be faced with if it is the turnout is very low.
No, thank you very much, and I think you're absolutely right about trying to highlight that the EU, that it isn't some far off institution, that it is something that engages with climate change, that it is something that, you know, can really bolster support during events like we saw during the pandemic, and as well also giving a unified response, say for things like what happened after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, so that it isn't just working by itself. And I was in the UK in the run-up to the Brexit referendum. I was working for Channel 4 News at the time, and this was really something that I saw from people that we interviewed, that the European Union was a very distant organization. It did nothing for us. It didn't have any role in our day-to-day life. And sometimes actually we would be standing in front of a school and on it was a plaque that said funded by the European Union. So, you know, even that somehow didn't kind of bring home the work of the European Union. But Sabrina, I wanted to go to you now. And my question to you is about disinformation and information manipulation. I guess from two foreign actors, China and Russia. Are you seeing at the moment any changes in their approach that might differ from the last elections? I know we've had the invasion of Ukraine, and also now China with the EU is kind of on tenterhooks following the Chinese ambassador's comments. But are you seeing any changes in their approach?
That's a very interesting question, because I think in this area generally, unfortunately, there's a lot of innovation, because certain gaps or certain opportunities are being closed down due to, be it regulation, more awareness, making things more costly, action by the social media platforms. All of these things call for constant innovation. So things that were easy in 2019 might be more challenging today. For example, and this is a general example, the sophistication of bot accounts has undergone a development, right? Like back in 2019, even, you know, I could understand that something was pretty much inauthentic by looking at it. But through advancement in technology also, these things have become more sophisticated. Also, like I'm really a little bit concerned about how the recent advancements in audiovisual production, but also textual production through artificial intelligence might give a boost with a view to next year. I unfortunately keep hearing that cheap fakes still work, so you don't need deep fakes, which we also see. But indeed, so there's this constant innovation, constantly trying new things, but there's also still a lot of the same old, just with different tactics. So I think the means that are being employed to manipulate might change slightly, but we still see the use of fake websites, fake experts on TV. We see impersonation of certain high-level speakers, high-level representatives, but it's getting trickier, I think, for the layperson to identify that at first glance. That's also why the work of experts is so important. In the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we have seen a little bit of an opportunistic kind of, I don't want to say working together, but Russia and China have opportunistically used certain kinds of elements of the other side to amplify, for example, the completely nonsense about biolabs in Ukraine, which was already there during COVID, might then be used again now by Russia, but might be picked up by China just because it fits other arguments on their side. So I think there's a couple of things to look out for, in particular, I think in the audiovisual area, but yeah. If you look at the entire arsenal, I think there's a lot of opportunities that we're watching out for, but a lot is still very much the same, just in a more sophisticated manner, I would say.
Thank you so much, and you're absolutely right about the speed of the innovation, and we've seen even over the last few months the rise of AI. But AI is definitely becoming a part of the more mainstream conversation. It has, of course, always been there. So yes, innovation is absolutely huge. I want to now start taking some questions from people. Once again, thank you very much for submitting them. And Michael, I was wondering if you would take this for us, actually. It's on transnational voting lists. Are there concrete steps, measures being proposed to increase citizen participation in the European elections that the speakers could share with us? This person wants to know about opportunities in the survey. So transnational voting lists, can they work? What are your thoughts on them? Do you think that they present a real meaningful opportunity in 2024? Michael?
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't totally sure. I thought I heard Michael.
Yes, it was you. Sure. It was you.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't prepare particularly for this question because I thought I'd just give some opening remarks, but I do have an opinion on this. If we look at the data side of voter turnout, we see two interesting things. The one is that in most member states, people vote in higher numbers for national elections and they vote for European Parliament elections. So this gives rise to this idea of second order elections, second level elections, being those for Europe. So this is one, if you look at the data, this is something where you would want to close the gap. That would already be a great achievement, I think, to increase turnout if you simply could start closing the gap. And that is one idea, I think, of the transnational list, that there is a real feeling that this European level has a political role. So this is not just, oh yeah, it's again about our well-known national parties here, and yeah, they send people to Brussels, not so important, but some people may send a signal because they care more about politics, and others say, we don't care very much because for the German, the politics is made in Berlin, and for the French in Paris, and Brussels is a sideshow. And with a transnational list, you can make much clearer, I think, that this is a whole different political space, that it is a European political space, and that the European Parliament election are the one moment where you connect these, and it's not just an assembly of government that you have directly elected, but that you are directly represented. And I think the transnational list makes that much more tangible, and in that sense, I think it's attractive. From a data point of view, I mentioned there are 2 points of interest. The other one for me is that you have significantly lower turnout in a number of Central and Eastern European countries. So it's not all of them, but some of them. And that's also interesting, I would say, if there is an opportunity, because the EU has become much more visible, yes, through COVID, but much more, of course, through the Russian war against Ukraine. So I wonder if for more voters in Central and Eastern Europe, it's now seen as something actually quite important, which you wouldn't just say, well, we don't know what that is, but that you say that determines actually how we in Europe position ourselves to an instance like the war against Ukraine. So this may give also some hope for increased turnout.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much. Sabrina, I want to go to you with this next question that we have from the audience on media bias. Media bias in itself can cause democratic backsliding in several ways. Example, the media not holding the government accountable for their mistakes or informing the public about policies that cause backsliding. And also, of course, journalists can be suppressed under more authoritarian regimes. What does the media have to do for 2024?
Well, I'm not in the business of telling the media what to do because they're independent. But media in general, when I talk about media, I mean independent media that actually deserves the name, and not media that pretends to be independent but is really just editorially controlled by a third state, like we've seen with RT and Sputnik, for example. So independent media is one of the key pillars that we have in democratic societies to hold authority to account. If we don't have that, we have a problem on many levels. Unfortunately, we see journalists targeted across the world through different means, including by suppression, but also through threats. There have been, unfortunately, too many reports about journalists being killed. And I think that is also something, I don't just think, but that is something that is very much on our mind. There is a regulation on its way against slap lawsuits. So journalists being flooded with lawsuits to actually drown them out, to make them disappear. And if we don't have journalists, we have several problems. Authority is not held to account anymore. We have less voices to actually provide factual information on different topics, be it climate change, be it migration, reporting about the elections, providing information about that. Now, a lot of independent journalists, media outlets are now also involved in fact-checking, which is a hugely important area. So I think they should just do what they have always been doing. Report independently, report about the things that are actually close to the people's hearts, because unfortunately disinformation and information manipulation attaches to exactly these things, right? Will I still be able to pay my rent next year? When I'm 70, will I be able to still live, or do I just not have any money because, you know, pensions are down? All of these things can be a field day for disinformation, unfortunately. I think within the European Union, at least, we're very much aware that we need to do more to protect independent journalism. However, in terms of making sure that they keep their independence, this needs to be very well thought through. So it's not just throwing money at them. But I think, yes, continue what they're doing, and also, network amongst them. I mean, just as a last point, some of the research that we've seen, some of the investigative journalism into I always forget, Vulcan files, for example, like that is amazing how across borders, news outlets and journalists have come together to look exactly into this kind of machinery, which gives us an immensely important insight, because we're only working with open source information. There's certain things we cannot do, but they can. So yeah, keep it up, I would say. And hugely important.
Thank you. Thank you very much for answering that question. Ingeborg, I'd like to come to you now. We have another question about voter turnout. And the question is this: in relation to the low voter turnout issue, do any of the speakers feel that incorporating a system that is currently in Australia, where voting is mandatory and not voting results in fines, this person says they knows that there's a counter argument about the rights to abstain, but with the current trend of increasingly lower voter turnout rates, may it be the only solution? What do you think?
Question is if it's the only solution, but it is definitely a solution that has been quite successful where it is used. And you can say that it's in many ways, I like this idea of that it's mandatory to participate in this election. You have to go and take a stand. This is your society. This is your union that you're living in. And you cannot just be, oblivious and not take a stand to what it's, who is going to lead it. So I think I like that idea, but I think it's kind of easier to deal with at national level than in a EU election. So maybe, it's not the right place to start this. I guess, it would be easier to do it in at national level than in the EU election. But it is very concerning that this backsliding of election participation that we see in many countries. And that, of course, means that we have to rethink the systems that we are using today. They are not, they are just man-made systems, and they can be changed. And that goes for the whole political system. Why do we, for example, and this is an idea that I have been thinking about for quite some time, why do we, for example, have parliaments, national parliaments, where people, couldn't we have a system where people have to, sit in the parliament for some time? You have just, what you call it, you don't go for elections, you just, take a sample of the population that will have to participate in one way or another. There are a lot of things that we could do. This is a man-made system, so they can be changed, and we need to rethink them. And especially when we are faced with a crisis situation, as we are in many ways in Europe today, they call for rethinking how we do things, how we do politics. What are the main issues that we are dealing with? But that's just for another discussion, not this one. But I think actually that this is one of the ideas that we could implement, to have a mandatory elections, but I think we should start at national level, not maybe in EU elections.
Michael, I can see your hand up, but just another question came in that follows on perfectly for you, Ingeborg, is lowering the voting age. I absolutely hear you when you say maybe we need to first start at national and then go to the European level. But when we look at, say, European engagement on the climate issue from younger people, for example, do you think that one solution is lowering the voting age for the European elections so that, we can have more input from younger voices that on certain issues are engaging very much with the European Union?
I think we should overall think about lowering the voting age. I don't know why we shouldn't, maybe it's because we think that people are children until they get the age of 18, but 16 is something that I think could be, and that is a discussion in many countries, to lower the voting age to 16. But if that is a solution, I don't think it's a kind of solution of the low turnout, but it is an idea that is worth discussing nonetheless.
Great, thank you. And Michael, you had your hand up. Did you have a point that you wanted to drop in?
Yeah, just to say that we have one member state that has mandatory voting, which is Belgium, and I think it also applies in European Parliament elections. So there's one example we could look at and study. I would say one shouldn't focus too much on the numbers, because saying, oh, we have greatly increased turnout because it's mandatory, it's maybe a little bit of a formalistic win. The question is, what does mandatory voting do to real participation, interest in politics, and so forth? And I don't know enough about what it does to Belgian society and Belgian political debates, but that could be interesting to study for sure.
Thank you. And actually, I didn't know that about Belgium, so I'm going to look into that after this conversation. I just wanted to put this out to all of you. Someone has asked a question about Hungary in particular, how to address the issue of unfair electoral system in Hungary for the upcoming elections. Would anyone like to take that? Michael, maybe?
Unfair electoral system.
In Hungary, how to address the issue of unfair electoral system in Hungary for the upcoming elections.
I must admit that I'm not familiar with how it is unfair regarding the EU elections specifically.
I mean, I think to call an election system unfair is always, it's quite hard, because there's a huge variety of electoral systems, and to make that point in a convincing way is not easy. But we know that the Hungarian government has always played around with the electoral system and has changed it a lot, and always in its favor, of course. And one thing that it loves to do is to force all its opponents to join up and bring to build lists, and that makes it very difficult because I come from very different ideological camps. So I cannot tell you the latest on the EP elections. I know there are big concerns about the way local election system was changed, but looking beyond the system, I mean, it's simply really the media also. I mean, you have here country where the state-funded media, the public media, are just from morning till evening making propaganda for one political party and against all the others. And clearly, this is one of the reasons, by the way, why OSCE said that these elections in Hungary do not conform to obligations that Hungary has clearly made or commitments it has made under the OSCE. So that in my opening words, I mentioned that, and I think this is definitely an interesting area to look into. I don't have a quick answer to it, but I mean, it's an interest to all Europeans that there should be fair and free elections in all our member states. So I slightly wonder if we have actually more legal instruments in the European toolbox, because it's in EP elections, to address that than we would have in cases where it's just a national election in Hungary or local election in Hungary. But it would need a bit more talk to our rule of law experts, I think.
I think, you know, it's difficult, especially as you said, to talk about unfair election systems, because election systems are different from one country to another. Countries are free to select their own systems. They don't have to have the same kind of systems, but they have to, of course, then carry out the elections in accordance with their legal framework. And what we've seen in many countries is that there's not a level playing field, and that has mainly to do, like was mentioned, with the captured media landscape, where the candidates do not have the same opportunities to campaign. They don't have the same access to the media. They don't have the same access to resources. They don't have same access to the to financing their election campaigning. That is the unlevel playing field that we see, and that happens before election. It's not what happens in the on the election day itself. Most countries carry out quite proper elections, especially European Union countries, proper elections, and have a kind of proper election legislation. But it's all the things that happen before the elections, where there are, you know, very different maybe opportunities and not a level playing field for candidates or parties.
Thank you both very much. Sabrina, I wanted to come to you next. One member of our audience is looking for answers, and they're looking for the person who is responsible for online disinformation, especially in view of the EP elections. Which person or group of people, I assume, leads policy and preparation towards social media platforms' responsibility in view of the election? So let's take a hone in here on social media. And of course, there's been an ongoing discussion between the European Union and the social media platforms. Who is responsible? Whose neck is on the block coming up to 2024?
The answer, as always, is not easy. I like how, you know, very specifically they want a name. You can do that by Googling, because I will tell you, it is not so clear cut. So the European Union, with the European Commission, you might want to look up Mr. Breton, is working on regulation through the Digital Services Act of specific areas of digital services, including social media platforms, where there is a focus on a whole host of things, including manipulation of these platforms. So in terms of who as a person is responsible of the EU efforts to tackle online disinformation, the regulation part is with the Commission. In view of the EP elections, this is not applicable in that case, because the regulation, of course, is very much broader. It applies outside of the EP election context and is applicable in general. So there is no specific regulation with a view to the EP elections. I will come back to that. The division of task in general on disinformation is the EEAS looks at foreign activity. That's what we have been mandated with. I'm going to catch up one of the other questions. We do not look at domestic disinformation. We have no mandate to do this. There are civil society organizations and also private industry who do this. But yes, we do not have a mandate to look into that. So therefore, my knowledge in detail is also limited. Of course, we do acknowledge that there is a link, but so we look at foreign actors. The Commission, of course, looks at, for example, regulation, but also election integrity. And then we have the member states. And actually, European elections are national elections. So in that regard, the member states' authorities are responsible for safeguarding their elections. Of course, there is cooperation. You can Google the European Cooperation Network on Elections, for example. They have a ton of information online. So to bring election authorities together, actually. But again, when we look at social media platforms, also the member states, of course, have exchanges with the social media platforms. In terms of legislation or regulation, this is different at the national level. There are some provisions in some of the EU member states that have specific provisions that there may not be shared any false information about the day of the election, for example, or any kind of campaigning ahead of the elections in a certain time span. And of course, we've seen this in a couple of member states also apply to social media platforms. But so unfortunately, I cannot tell you the one person, because as always in the European Union, it's a shared responsibility. That's why we're the European Union. And that's also what makes us stronger in a way, but makes things more complicated in many areas.
Thank you so much. And of course, disinformation, it also spirals out into many different areas, so that it always requires collaboration from many different people, indeed. So I would like to now introduce Professor Alberto Alemanno. Thank you very much for joining us. Why don't we, I'd like to just have your opening comments, but for five or so minutes, 5 to 7 minutes or so, on the survey. We're talking about risks and opportunities. So I would love to hear, I think everyone would love to hear your thoughts on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amanda. Hello, everyone. Apologies for being late in joining you. There were some logistical issues that prevented me from being with you since the beginning. My perspective on the next European elections is pretty macro. I've been trying to identify a few trends. So when looking at the results of your surveys, I was not necessarily too surprised or too shocked. I think most of the findings somehow support what we observers have been somehow fearing or simply predicting. Let me start by saying a line that I really like from Sabrina. European elections are national elections. And this is not, and that's where I disagree with Sabrina, an element of strength for the European Union. It's a structural dimension that prevents the European Union to show up prepared to actually defend its democratic infrastructure. And this is true at different levels, from disinformation all the way to the substantive nature of this electoral competition that remains very national and which prevents the average citizens to understand basically what's going on, what's in for them, why should they show up and vote in 2024. I remember in 2019, on the very same day in which the European Council decided to designate Ursula von der Leyen as their chosen candidate. And I remember designing that particular moment, defining that particular moment as lap to European democracy, as lap to the European Parliament. And I think that's where we basically see an original sin in these European elections. Since 2009, with the Lisbon Treaty, we have been moving towards a parliamentary majority system, meaning that unless the Parliament agrees on the head of state and government designation, we're not going to be able to choose the political color of our executive. This is a defining element, which in reality is not fully established yet. And we see uncertainty, we see confusion, we see that the European Union suffers less and less of a democratic deficit. Everybody has been somehow elected directly and indirectly, but it suffers from a democratic, or what I call an intelligibility deficit. The EU is not readable, is not intelligible to most of us, not even the experts, not even those who devote their life to the day-to-day, the nitty-gritty of European integration. In the absence of a Europeanization of the electoral competition, everything becomes a bit more difficult and more complicated. I give you two examples as a concluding remarks of my introduction here, hopefully without overlapping with what has already been said. My major concern a few months, I would say 12 months before the next, 14 months before the next European election, has to do with turnout. So turnout, I don't know how much time you have devoted to it, but as you know, systematically since 1979, the first universal suffrage, till 2019, we have been to 2014, we have been seeing an erosion of turnout, right? We moved from an average of 60% to approximately 40+%. But then 2019, the miracle happened. We managed to get one elector out of two to actually vote and show up. But again, I think many things happened since then that might have confused the average elector, not necessarily the Spitzenkandidaten loss, but the overall lack of Europeanization of the political process, and in particular, the Qatar scandal. The Qatar gate is difficult to quantify the negative impact it had, but if you look at the Eurobarometer, as I did a few weeks ago, you will see that there is a significant drop in the trust that the average citizen has vis-a-vis European institutions. European institutions continue to be more trusted than the average national ones. So the EU continue to leverage on that advantage, but there's been a drop. And one of the claims I've been making over the last few weeks has been that the European institutional and political response to the Qatar gate is simply not up to the task. He has not been able to remedy the damage caused. We basically had three different reactions. The first one by the President of the European Parliament, Roberta Metsola, saying, it is not our fault. This is an attack coming from the outside. It's an attack to European democracy. The second response by Madame von der Leyen looked like relief. Relief for not being the Commission at the center of the scandal by the European Parliament, as if the average citizen would be able to make a distinction between the European Parliament and the European Commission. Of course, he won't. The entire European Union image has been damaged. And the third, by the European Council, head of state and government, saying in mid-December, this is the Parliament problem, as if they were not leading political parties who will be presenting their vision to the average European citizens in a few months' time. As a result of that, we know there is a democracy package that is coming up as a matter of few weeks. You have discussed some of those issues. You might not have mentioned the major piece of that democracy package that tries to provide an answer to the Qatar gate, which is the so-called foreign influence legislation. So there will be a proposal, most likely, of a directive by the European Commission, DG Justice, Madame Jourova, that will, for the first time, make it mandatory for every single member state the creation of a transparency register for any kind of entity that will be acting on behalf of a third country. Virtually none of these foreign affairs legislation, often called foreign agents legislation, has been able to strike a good balance, a right balance between two competing claims. On the one hand, to allow third countries to exercise influence on the political process of another country, which is allowed under public international law, and the need to make it transparent and accountable. Most of this legislation, from the FARA in the US all the way to Australia, the UK, and Canada, have been somehow shrinking civil space, have been compressing the freedom of expression and assembly. And this piece of legislation might actually be and simply embody an anti-NGO sentiment that is currently emerging and which will probably become one of the major fertile ground for the opposition between the left and the right in the coming months. I'm going to stop here, but I hopefully brought some new elements to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Alberto. I asked the other speakers after their opening statement one question, and then we'll go quickly back. We have 15 minutes left, quickly back to the floor. I wanted to bring up rule of law concerns. Of course, there's so much going on at the moment, but do you think that some voters might see that a lack of firm action on rule of law has kind of, made them go down the path of disengagement with the European Union, that they want stronger action in Poland and Hungary, for example? Rule of law, your thoughts?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a big question, but the rule of law is not an issue for Hungary and Poland. It's an issue for every single citizen of the Union. The moment in which the Polish judicial system is no longer independent, its decision will affect any other citizens. Not only if you're married to a Pole and you get married and the custody decision for your kids has to be decided, or you get into a divorce, but even if for a simple extradition, these Polish judges will be involved, other citizens, the justice systems, which is based on mutual recognition, will be put into question. So I don't know how aware all citizens are about the major negative repercussions of the rule of law crisis on their life, but it's pretty clear that over time there is increased awareness. And this issue has been showing the weakness of the European Commission, and in particular the method which today governs the functioning of the European Union, which is no longer the community method, according to which there is a European interest that primes over the national interest, but we have embraced the Merkel method, the method according to which we cannot advance unless everybody is with us. And this is exactly what has stopped the ability of the European Commission to play its role of the guardian of the treaty, which is written very clearly since the 1950s. And we have many studies suggesting how during the last 15 years, the European Commission has given up the play its full role, with a major decrease in the number of infringement actions, with a systematic inability to start administrative proceedings under Article 258, which might then lead to judgment and sanctions. So in a way, the European Commission is no longer acting under the rules that have been originally agreed by the founding fathers in the 50s, and it has moved away. It has moved into another system, which is basically the current integration, which is led by the head of state and government, and we have a commission secretary, which is basically the European Commission following the advice. Conditionality is changing something possible. It's the first time ever in which we made the transfer of resources conditional upon the completion of certain reforms. But as you might have seen in the last 24 hours, there are signals which are very concerned. All watchdogs start saying that the Polish and the Hungarian haven't necessarily satisfied with the so-called milestones, according to which, or determining whether this transfer of resources might have occurred. And yet there's a signal of, let's say, relaxation by the Commission saying, you're going to get the funding, don't worry too much. So I'm deeply concerned, and hopefully the rule of law will become another contentious area among the various conflicting political views of Europe that will be presented to the electorate.
Thank you so much. Actually, given the time, what I think might be beneficial is, could I go around to each of you, all four of you, starting with you, Michael, and kind of, I would be really curious to know, like, your takeaway thought. We're a year out, we want more people to engage with the European elections, risk or opportunity, but what does our audience need to know going away? What can they do in their jobs to kind of bring more people in and create more energy around the EP elections?
Thank you, Amanda. You had put me down for closing remarks. Are these the closing remarks?
Not quite. It's
Not
more
quite.
like it's kind of like the sandwich in the lunchbox.
Right,
just a
right.
quick takeaway note.
Right. Well, I think I would focus on two things to build a bit on what Sabrina already has said about media dynamics. I would ask journalists to rethink their approach to portray every European Parliament election as a crisis election, and the only big horse race issue is how strong will be extremist parties in the European Parliament, and will that destroy the EU? This is the framing we are getting for decades. It's tired, and it doesn't help, I think, democracy, because it gives a lot of oxygen to those parties. It's all about them. I mean, you remember how all the liberal media have basically made Trump big because they couldn't stop talking about them. It's a bit like that, not that extreme. But if it's the only thing that we are interested in the bigger picture of European Parliament elections, we are missing something. But it also means that there is an obligation, I would say, for the democratic parties on the right, the left, and the center of the European Parliament to have strong debates, so that there is something interesting for media to report on. So the democratic parties cannot lean back and say, oh, it's all vote for us, otherwise it's extremist. That's not good enough. Come forward with your positions and please discuss with each other. And the Spitzenkandidaten system would help. I'm afraid for the non-German speaker, it may become the Spitzenkandidatinnen system to make it more complicated, maybe about women. And it would help a lot, I think, because Alberto is very right. The EU is so hard to understand, but if it would finally work out that this, Spitzenkandidatinnen really make it then to the top position, it would just give a lot more visibility to this political struggle between these two sides. And I think that is, in a way, the key to many other questions of turnout and interest in these elections, that people feel it is political now. We have seen it was political in COVID, it is political in Ukraine, and we have a political choice to make now. And we, as NGOs, etc., we can underpin this, we can, generate more interest, have more events like this one. But the core, I think, is this really public debate that is going on every day. Thanks.
Thank you. Ingeborg, what is your takeaway point? What do you want people to know when it comes to engagement in the European elections?
I think there are three groups that have an important role to play in these elections as in any other elections. First of all, it's of course the politicians. And I think it is now time for the politicians to make use of some of these old-fashioned old-time methods, to go out and talk to people, and that is, I think, what is missing in many elections, both at national level, local level, and I guess even more so at EU level. Politicians have to interact directly with the constituencies. And I think that is really important. So people get a kind of access to these politicians. And I think also another group that has a very important role to play is the people in the NGOs. So the civic space, it has to be ensured that there is that they have a playing field, the NGOs in the civic space. And because it was mentioned here that there's an idea, if I understood it correctly, to have a foreign agent legislation to kind of deal with this disinformation that comes from external actors, then I got a little bit alarmed, because when you talk about foreign agent legislation, then it makes me think about Russia and those countries that are close to Russia, because they have had foreign agent legislation and they have been, stopping organization from working. This has been the main tool against the independent NGOs, these foreign agent legislation. So we have to be careful. And we have been saying to the Russians, to the Kazakhs, to the, other countries, that we have been opposing this foreign agent legislation that they have had. So it is important to be very careful when it comes to this kind of legislation in the EU countries. And it could, if it's not properly done, could impact the NGOs and their playing field in these countries. The third group I want to mention are the journalists that have already been mentioned here. They, of course, have a very important role to play to reflect on the whole political discussion that leads up to the EU elections. But then they, like was mentioned, the politicians will have to give them some something to report on. They will, and that's important for those who are liberal or support the liberal democratic values that we want to cherish, that they give the journalists something to reflect on. So I would like to mention these three groups: politicians, NGOs, and journalists. They really have an important role to play before these elections. And they need strong debates. They need, to activate the grassroots in the elections.
Thank you so much. And Sabrina, your takeaway point for our audience, please.
It's really hard to come away with just one point from this discussion because it's so broad. I think for me personally, the questions have shown that there is indeed much more awareness, but also interest in the topic of disinformation, foreign disinformation, but also generally disinformation, how it works and how it can impact our democratic processes and institutions. I think, unfortunately, as always, there are no easy answers, especially in this area where when you look at the content side in particular, we also look at the behavior side. But if you look at this area in general, there's so much that can go wrong. We've seen around the globe, unfortunately, fake news laws, that we're allegedly fighting fake news, but really we're just used as a pretense to crack down on independent speech and freedom of expression. So I think one of the things that we try to do here is be quite transparent, especially for a government organization, quite transparent about what we do. We regularly, every day, we publish on the website that I mentioned, EU versus Disinfo. We also publish in other reports. We engage a lot in this type of webinar because we want an understanding to grow, that this is a shared responsibility. It's not just the EU it's different EU institutions, it's the member states, it's civil society, it's private industry. There is not the one actor that can magically solve this, but it's also each and every individual person who bears a responsibility of checking what kind of information they consume. I just heard a phrase, you know, take your information diet as seriously as your real diet. I'm not sure if we should encourage anyone to diet, but this is really, every EU citizen, every citizen around the world, every person has a responsibility to be careful about what they share and how they engage in discussions. And I think this webinar actually gave me quite some hope that there is this kind of reflex to be critical, but also to try to find out what is happening, even at the complex level of the European institution.
Thank you so much. And just for those of you that that can't see the questions or aren't looking at them, actually the majority of questions have been about disinformation. So clearly in our audience, if we take that sample, it is one of the leading topics. And I would encourage people to look at EU versus Disinfo as well. It is a great resource to see what's going on in the disinformation space, and for fact checking as well. I know I use it quite regularly in my own work. So thank you very much. So Alberto, I know you've just joined us, and we wish we had you for longer, but your kind of, your sales pitch for what should people know now about the European elections for engagement?
Well, I think there is an unprecedented window of opportunity for Europe to talk to people. In other words, I've been in this business as an academic and advocate for European integration and equalization of access to power for over 20 years, but it is unprecedented, the demand for more knowledge, more information around what the European Union does, how it works. The European Union, amid the COVID crisis and certainly the Russian invasion of Ukraine and many other episodes that have been shaping our individual life and gave us a shared experience of life. Both COVID and the Russian invasion, they gave us, and they put citizens all in the same place, despite geography, despite of the rest, at least prima facie. All of this creates this opportunity because citizens start looking at the European Union no longer as a troublemaker, but as a problem fixer, because the EU provide actual solutions in a way that it has never been able to do. I mean, joint procurement of medicines, of ammunition is something that would have been absolutely inconceivable only 10 years ago, and now is happening, is what's happening, what is negotiating in this town. But there's a mismatch between the reality of policymaking and how people see this. And I agree with Michael, the narrative around the elections is just too reductionist, too narrow, too banal, too trivial. And we are all fed up with it. But what is making the news is always the extremes gaining more points. And since this time is going to happen again, because if you look at the scenarios, we know there would be a major compression of the major four dominant parties, you know, from the Liberals, Socialists, EPP, and with a major loss of the Greens, as we all expect, with the left shrinking and the right somehow growing, this narrative will get another boost. And that's exactly what the journalists should not be covered. So who is the major actor? In my view, it is not the institution, and I sympathize a lot with Sabrina's point. It's not the institutions to tell how good they are and how well prepared to tackle transnational challenges are. But the question is what the European political parties are able to do. And by the way, who are the political parties? Nobody knows what the European political parties do because they are loose federation of national political parties. So again, unless we Europeanize this political competition by forcing every single national party to tell us, where do you stand in Europe? You know, there are parties like the Five Star Movement in Italy. They've been in government twice, and we still don't know where they sit here because they're independent, right? So unless we start talking about the rules of the game, and that's what is basically the electoral law, we're not going to create the conditions for unleashing our democratic imagination and to envision different Europes. It's all so messy and confused that we always have to look at Europe through the prism of the national states. So European political parties and their members are certainly the first liable for making this electoral competition intelligible to the many. And then, of course, the media sphere. So we need these actors basically taking responsibility for this. We saw some improvement over time. We're gonna see more and more grassroots movements pushing for first-time voters, for youth votes, which could really make a difference, as we all know. And hopefully this positive experience of 2019 will be repeated in 2024. I think the European Parliament communication has been doing an incredible work in not communicating itself, but empowering others, civil society organizations like ours, influencers, including academics, NGOs, journalists, media influencers, and other actors to actually play a role and to be somehow a major alert for individual people to say, hey, this election matters to you, matters to us, and beautify and potentially humanize the European elections. I think this will be the challenge. We are one year ahead. I think it is possible to do it, but the overall political climate, because of the geopolitically shattered world in which we live, is certainly making things more complicated instead of making it easier or smoother. So there are many obstacles to that narrative to emerge.
Thank you so much. And I think something I've kind of gotten from everybody during the last hour and a half is taking the crisis element out, toning down the kind of rhetoric around it, and kind of maybe looking at the European elections from kind of a systematic, consistent way of looking at all the different opportunities and risks as well. So that's it from me. I'd like to hand over to Michael for some brief closing remarks. I'd like to thank the speakers for engaging with me, the audience for their questions. There is a link to feedback on this webinar as well. So thank you very much. You won't hear from me again. Michael, closing remarks. Thank you.
We hope to hear from you again, Amanda, but maybe not in this event.
Not in this event.
Okay. Yeah, well, thank you very much. We are already over time, so I will keep this very short. I just had one more thoughts on the disinformation piece, which dominated the conversation a bit. I think it's also a place to show that where the EU can deliver, because compared to 2019, there are so many more instruments now. We have a code of practice against disinformation with working groups, including all the big platforms and NGOs and so on. And we are working there on the European Parliament election. So that was unheard of in 2019. You were lucky if you could drink a coffee with somebody from Meta. Now they're all sitting in working groups and they have to provide reports, and they cannot afford to ignore the conversation, basically. I still see a slight gap if you look at what Sabrina and her colleagues are doing, looking at foreign disinformation. We don't have that much of systematic monitoring of disinformation in the domestic context in 27 member states. It's a bit haphazard. It's somehow expected NGOs do it, but they don't get much funding for doing it. So there we still have a bit of a gap, but we do have a lot more than we had in 2019. Soon we will also have the National Services Coordinator in each member state under the Digital Services Act. So the question whom to call, we can provide more and more telephone numbers in the months and years to come. So again, it's something the EU has been doing, has been regulating. And I think that's a good example why we need it. And with this, I thank you all four for joining us for this debate. It was great to have you here. I thank all the viewers to join us for the many questions. It's for sure not the last discussion that we have on the European Parliament elections. And I hope we can all give a contribution to make these elections very meaningful, to make them a real democratic choice of different good democratic options and a renewal of politics in the European Parliament and the EU at large. So I wish you a good afternoon. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon.
Bye-bye.